Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the GLAS Hour. It's been an unusual year for GLAS. We've only managed to have one live event. That was way back in February before the pandemic started to take hold. But surprisingly enough, we've still managed to have more events this year than any other year, and that's because of the format we've been using, such as tonight, where we have an hour of conversation with somebody who's written an interesting book. And tonight we talk to Mukesh Kapila. He'll be the 10th author in this series. Before we get into that, I'd just like to say that how grateful we are to all those who responded to the John Spillane concert a couple of weeks ago. It was a great outpouring of support for the Edith Wilkins Foundation for Street Children. I just heard a message from them today on their Facebook page that they've rescued another two children who were in danger of being trafficked in Darjeeling. And of course, the residential home there is operating under very difficult circumstances at the moment because COVID is rampant in Darjeeling. But the staff are doing the best they can, looking after the kids who are in residential care there, and also trying to do some outreach in a small way to the nearby slums. So please keep supporting that worthwhile cause if you can. Every little helps. And I'd like to also to say that this extraordinary level of activity over the last year would not have been possible without the support of my good friend Owen O'Sullivan, who's in charge of all these productions and does a fantastic job. And it takes valuable time away from which he could be spending with his family and playing his guitar. Many thanks to Owen. So let me introduce our guest tonight by reading you something which he has written. It goes like this. When you are living in the middle of history as it is being made, and especially if chance or fate has given you a small role to play, you are not actually conscious of it. On the good days, you may briefly catch yourself in the thought that you're making a real difference. Mostly, however, you are too busy navigating reality, trying to stay afloat. It's only afterwards, in Shakespeare's words, when the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, that events find their rightful place in the helter-skelter of your mind and the confusion in your heart. It is only then that you can properly assess the significance of what you have experienced. And so that brings me on to welcome Mukesh Kapila to the GLAS Hour, the man who wrote those words. And it was written the fine book in front of me called No Stranger to Kindness, which is about a very eventful, adventurous life in the world of aid and development. I don't think you'll find it too rude of me to describe him as a kind of Indiana Jones of the aid world. He's been at the scene of nearly every major disaster we're talking about over the last 40 years. And he has gathered some great insights from those experiences, which he has shared with us in this great book called No Stranger to Kindness. You're very welcome, Mukesh.
Thank you, Dennis. Glad to be with you.
Well, it's good to see you, Mukesh. Could I ask first, just to get going, ask you a little bit about how you managed to write this book and how you found the time to do it, and what was your method in terms of gathering the material? Because, frankly, I find it quite amazing the level and clarity of your recall of events which have happened many, many years ago.
Well, I have a theory, and that is that the important things one remembers. And if you can't remember anything, it wasn't important in the first place. And some events are so seared in your memory, and to the point that the emotions are still raw as you think about them, that actually I had no difficulty in recalling deeply impressionable moments in what has been, as you said, many decades of experience. And I have some records. I have my notebooks, a huge family of notebooks, in fact, and those have all helped me. Also had a co-writer, and she has been very helpful, Jen Roberts, and she was very helpful to me as we worked our way through the book.
And did you work on it full time, or did you just plug away at it when you found spare time?
Oh, it was very much a question of spurts of writing, I should say. In other words, there would be a week or two of intensive engagement. Especially when your memories are evoked, when you go down uh, a memory lane, and your mind is transported back to Bangladesh or Sudan or wherever you are thinking about, then I think hours can pass and sometimes even days can pass. And in between, of course, you have to get on with real life in the present day.
I was particularly taken by your description of your childhood growing up in India and how fortuitous it is, in fact, that you ended up in the career path that you took. Perhaps you could tell us about how important your family background was to your development into Dr. Mukesh Kapila and someone who was so influential in the world of humanitarian aid.
Well, I mean, it's of course all in retrospect. I'm not sure I appreciated my background very much when I was living that background, but as circumstances, as the throw of the took me, I relied more and more on my own background. There's nothing like going away to a foreign place to learn about your own home in your own heart as much as anything. So, in a sense, I brought up a story from my grandmother, who described how she escaped from what is now Pakistan to what is now India at partition in 1947. I was, of course, born. I may look old, but I'm not that old. And so she describes how the train on which she was traveling, along with 10 children, of which my father was one, was rescued or kept under protection by a young man from Switzerland carrying the Red Cross flag. And at that time, of course, there was no Geneva Convention, but we did have the ICRC, and under international humanitarian law, and the ICRC was a protecting power of the migrants that went from one country to the other in those bloody weeks in 1947. And so my father survived, and I was born. So, and when I kind of progressed my life as a physician, well, of course, the emblem of the cross, Red Cross, even though you're not supposed to use it, is ubiquitous all around you. So then, when I ended up in Geneva, many years later, through many chapters of life, and found myself working for the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent, IFRC, the sister organization to ICRC, it felt like some kind of a secular act of history, some kind of coming home. And somewhere in the archives of the ICRC are the family records of my parents and his siblings as they fled from Pakistan to India, because you know what the ICRC is. It kind of records everything meticulously.
I think one of the features of this book that comes out about your character, Mukesh, is the feeling of being an outsider. What do you attribute that to? Was it the fact that you're descendant, at least on one side of your family, from refugees, or the fact that you were transported at such a young age from India to public school in England and on to the is it the dreaming spires of Oxford and Cambridge?
Yeah, well, to be frank with you, I have never felt comfortable wherever I've been. So I don't know why that is. It may well be that, as you say, being forced to migrate, myself at the age of 16, all on my own. We are talking here of the early 1970s. So we're talking of a very different world. And every step was like having to understand a new culture. And I don't mean just the culture of the country or the culture of the setting, but the institutions I was in, whether it was school, whether it was at university, or in subsequent jobs. And so in that sense, it was a degree of feeling that everywhere I had to go, I had to, in a sense, navigate my way, as I say in the book, through what I found myself in those institutions.
And as an aid worker, of course, you always are an outsider, aren't you? I mean, you're there for short periods of time on the outside looking in. And I think one of the things that comes across in this book, to me anyway, is your ability to have empathy for the victims, for those who are suffering, whose suffering you usually have come to try and alleviate. And I thought you started off very well with your first experiences in the international arena in Cameroon. Perhaps you could describe a little bit how exciting that was for you as a young man, as a young doctor, newly qualified doctor, on one of your first assignments overseas.
Yes, when I was in Cambridge, working as a junior public health physician, and there was a volcano. Oops, now I'm getting ahead of the story. There was a mysterious event in northwest Cameroon near Bamenda, which is the Anglophone part of Cameroon, where apparently hundreds of people, several hundred people, had been found mysteriously dead. And so I was part of a small team sponsored by the British government to go and investigate. I was the only public health person in the team. The others included a geologist and a physician and so on. And when I got there, it was like a mystery how to disentangle the clues that we found on this extremely remote hillside close to the Nigerian border between Nigeria and Cameroon, and try to piece together with my basic knowledge of public health as to what could be the causes of this mysterious deaths, which left people completely unmarked, and yet they were lying dead. And we figured out, and this required really teamwork, working with the geologist on the team and occupational health colleague, to figure out that this was actually a volcanic explosion underground that had led to the leak of carbon dioxide, sulfur, and many other horrible gases that had gone up and rolled down and killed all these people. But it was only after quizzing the oldest person in the community that one could figure out that this wasn't new. It had happened in previous years. And that's why it was really, that was the insight that I learned. Always ask the local people, and they'll lead you to the answer more than perhaps my textbooks could.
Absolutely. And the situation in Cameroon today, does it surprise you to see that it's on the verge of civil war?
Yes. In fact, I've been in touch with some friends who are working on Cameroon, and it breaks my heart to think that this is happening. But the problem is in Cameroon and in other countries that where you have unfinished business in a country, and unfinished tensions are kept suppressed through dictatorship and the inability of people to express their views, their feelings, their concerns, their aspirations. Then things like that volcano I saw all those years ago, then they bubble up. So I'm afraid unless Cameroon deals with its fundamental issues, which is to do with democracy and equality of its people, it will continue to suffer.
In many locations that you've visited over the years, Mukesh, you attribute some of the underlying factors driving conflict to the legacy of colonialism. Cameroon, I suppose you could make the case for the British and French influence having being played out still today in the politics there.
Well, colonial, yes. I mean, to be honest, my views have evolved. Absolutely, colonialism has indeed caused many historic problems that we see today. And this is part of the unfinished business I was talking about earlier. However, I don't think people living in these countries, for example, my own country of birth, India, I do not think we can blame the British forever and ever for the problems of contemporary India. And the same is true of other countries. So I think it's time to let go of those kinds of alibis and deal with the issues and take responsibility. Each country and its populations have to take responsibility for the issues as they face them today. They cannot kind of hide behind the past or use the past as an excuse for not addressing today's problems.
As your career developed internationally, you seem to have had some qualms about your status as a lord of poverty, in quotation marks. Could you talk a little bit about that? You know, the sense that as an aid worker, you live a life that's very much distant and apart from the lives of the people that you're trying to help.
Well, absolutely. I mean, very often in my more reflective moments, I think that I lived my life. I lived my life the wrong way around. In other words, my having done my medical clinical job to get my health qualifications, I joined the Foreign Commonwealth Office, which what's now called the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK government, as an aid advisor, as a health advisor, in fact, and was a donor, therefore. So my earliest job as a arena was to go around the world giving out money to countries. And I hope I'm honest enough in the book to say that I look back on those days, I can't help but feeling somewhat embarrassed as to how arrogant the young Mukesh was, and how certain I felt that I had the answers to the world, and how patronizing I suppose I was in dealing with the recipients of our aid. We are talking here about the 1980s and 90s, where I think the modern questions was not there. So in a sense, I feel that if I was a donor now, I would be much smarter than I was then. So, but I subsequently have tried to kind of redress some of those imbalances.
Well, I think you did that in there's a great description in the book of your journey across Southern Africa. I guess that was sometime in the early 90s. You started off in Malawi and you went to Zimbabwe, where you came across a Quaker hospital, which inspired you to develop one of the largest ever HIV/AIDS programs for Southern Africa. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
Yes, I mean, I was based at that time in the British Aid office in Malawi, and my remit covered Southern Africa, which basically was defined in those days as anything below Congo. So one day, a colleague and I decided that we would go on a road trip, and we toured Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, kind of round tour. This was soon after the end of the war in Mozambique, so it was possible to go through what was called the TET corridor. And coming to Zimbabwe, a missionary hospital there, I saw for the first time in my life, in great detail, what happened to HIV and AIDS patients or AIDS patients. And I also witnessed the first treatments for AIDS. And I was both appalled and enlightened at the same time, and particularly inspired of the living miracle of the antiretrovirals. I mean, there are echoes of that today when we have been desperately looking for treatments for COVID. And for me, this is like an echo of the miracle I witnessed with the first antiretrovirals in Southern Africa. And I saw how totally devastating AIDS was in Southern Africa at that time. Any of my projects, I mean, today we talk about COVID disrupting economies and development. Many of the projects that I was doing in the 1990s on behalf of the British government in Southern Africa were devastated by the impact of AIDS, when something like 30% of the people died of HIV, whether you were a teacher, or a doctor, or at school, or even a civil servant. So we could see the mass destruction caused by that particular virus. And I learned many lessons. And to this very day, I think my experience of AIDS haunts me and, in a sense, guides me in whatever else I've done since then.
Quite soon after that, you were sent to Rwanda on an exploratory mission as the genocide was unfolding. and the news was slowly getting out about the appalling atrocities that were being committed there. That was a very, I would say, frightening experience, but also one that influenced you hugely for the rest of your career, no?
Yes, I found myself in 1994 volunteering to go to Rwanda when the kind of office announcement went out if someone would go there. You know, in those days, we didn't have humanitarian departments in the sense that donors have now and organizations have. There was an emergency aid department, and but they were busy with all sorts of things. And I was in Africa anyway, in Malawi. So I said, okay, I will go to Rwanda. And to cut a long story short, I found myself driving from Uganda down into Rwanda. And this was during the 100 days of killings. And I remember vividly driving to Kigali as the night was falling. And the city was deathly quiet. And the word deathly quiet really takes on a special meaning. The only heard was dogs howling as if up the dead bodies. And then, literally there were piles of dead bodies. And when I went to the church and so on, because that was some of the killings had taken place inside the sanctuary of the churches in Rwanda, it was totally horrifying. I mean, I'm used to dead bodies as a physician, but I had never actually seen mass slaughter on that scale until then. And then trying to understand the evil that people can commit onto each other. Well, that trip in 1994 and completely changed the subsequent trajectory of my life, as well as, of course, my personal attitudes to, I suppose, the evils and goods of humanity.
Was it in the case of Rwanda? Was it there you expressed the opinion that you accused the international community of double dealing, self-interest and paralysis?
It was utterly awful. You know, there are some things about Rwanda that are still not yet out in the open. That's because some governments, like my own in the British government, have closed the files for longer than the usual period. The files are closed. And, you know, and I was a government official, a mid-level government official at that time. This was in 1994. And information was passing across my desk, diplomatic cables, intelligence reports, communications from our UK mission in Geneva, information from other Security Council members like France, and it was absolutely and utterly clear that I didn't know about the word genocide then, but what was going on there were mass atrocities. And the idea that we didn't know what happened in Rwanda until afterwards, until peacekeepers went in and so on, is utter and total nonsense. General Dallaire, who became a good friend and mentor afterwards, he was sending telegrams and cables with horrendous to New York. So all this was happening, and we actually knew about this, though we pretended that it didn't exist.
General Dallaire was the head of the UN peacekeeping force.
Yes, he was the head of the UN force, and classically he was then ordered by the then Secretary General Boutros Ghali and his Under Secretary for Peacekeeping Kofi Annan to actually leave. So the UN abandoned the country at the moment that the country needed, that Rwanda needed the UN most.
That's quite staggering, isn't it, when you reflect on it, how that could happen? What do you put that down to? Do you think it's something to do with the UN as an institution, or do you think it's the individuals who found themselves in positions of authority and did not take the opportunity to intervene?
Well, at that time, and let me say straight away to start with, things are much better now than they used to be. And we can come to that as to how they came to be, though they're not perfect now, and by no means the UN is doing as much as it should. But certainly at that time, the way the UN system worked and the way the inter-country diplomacy, including the Security Council, worked. And remember, I knew a lot about the Security Council because the UK is a permanent member of the Security Council, and as part of my normal job in the Foreign Office, I had interactions. I went to New York and so on. But basically, the way the system worked in those days was that people at the top did not want to know about what was going on in case it caused political embarrassment. So the UN was there to protect the countries as opposed to what it says in the UN Charter. So that was one thing. Also, I found that many of the top people, with honorable exceptions, General Dallaire being the classic example, they are cowards. They are total cowards, and they have no courage. And there has been far too much careerism in the UN. People far more concerned with keeping their jobs and getting promoted and not causing offense than anything else. So these were betrayals at the time that were of a staggering proportion, that were taking place routinely.
The other side of the coin to the Rwanda genocide was, of course, the mass exodus from Rwanda into neighboring Zaire, as it was then, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that posed a different sort of dilemma, didn't it? I mean, in terms of providing humanitarian assistance to a population which was sheltering many of those who had been involved in the genocide itself in Rwanda. And I should say at this point, declare my own interest in this, because I was actually a relief coordinator in Goma at that time. But of course, we were very conscious of the fact that, you know, the population that we were helping included many who had blood on their hands and were guilty of genocide.
Yes, I mean, I found myself in Goma, and you will remember, Dennis, that hundreds of thousands of people were on the march, and I actually happened to be in Goma more by chance rather than great planning or foresight on my part. I happened to be in Goma on the very day that the mass exodus took place, and this is that was and is the fastest exodus in human history. Incidentally, when my grandmother and her 9-10 children left Pakistan for India in 1947, that had the record of the fastest and greatest exodus in history, and that record was broken only in Goma in 1994. Anyway, I mean, you know that expression we have in English, people dying like flies. And as you will remember, literally, as you were driving on the road in Goma, and you would see people staggering on the path in front of you, and as they died from cholera, exhaustion, and God knows what else, if you like. And I remember driving into Rwanda from the Goma side, from the Zaire side, on that day with Sergio, a good colleague from UNHCR, whose vehicle we were using. And I was utterly and totally astounded by what I saw. So, we calculated that on that were 1 million people on the road. And the way we calculated that was simply on my watch, which has stopped working now, but the predecessor of my watch. We calculated the number of people we saw at a moment in time. And then as far as the eye could see, there were people in the bush. At that time, Rwanda was deeply wooded. It was forested country. And so we couldn't see what was in the bush, but you could get, the flash of clothing and so on. And then so we estimated from that there were, roughly speaking, 300 or 400 people on the road, 400,000 on the road, and maybe twice that in the bush. And my abiding memory to this day is a little boy I saw sitting on the step on his own in Ruhengeri outside the hospital, and all the beds with the patient still attached, lying on, resting on the road, and people had abandoned the hospital beds. They first tried to drag the beds along with them towards. Obviously, they gave up, and so these patients are lying there with their kind of legs up and drips in them and such like. So I've got some horrible memories, and I never returned to Rwanda for nearly 20 years because I couldn't bear to go back.
Another milestone in your career, Mukesh, seems to have been when the new Labour came to power in the UK under Tony Blair, and your boss, your new boss, was Claire Short. What is this new humanitarianism of which you speak?
Well, I remember so vividly the day that Labour came into power after a long period of Conservative government in Britain. And I'm not trying to make any great political statements other than to say that under the Conservative government at that time, and Linda Chalker, by the way, was a very good overseas development minister under the Conservatives, a very kind lady. But essentially speaking, ODA, as it was called in those days, was simply
Overseas Development Aid.
Overseas Development Administration was simply a check writing agency and a charitable agency. It literally gave out charity. Now, to be honest, there's nothing wrong in giving out charity when it desperately needed. There are people who need to be helped, you see. But the manifesto of the Labour Party had just 2 sentences in it, which talked about one, multilateralism, and then it talked about looking at the crisis. That was it. And when Short swept in, I was given the charge of writing the chapter to do with emergencies and crises, because it was up to the civil servants to kind of devise the policy on the basis of the manifesto of the party that had won the election. And there were literally just 2 sentences. They were cut and pasted, and I was presented to me and said, "Write." And so I said, "Wow, now I have the opportunity to actually put on paper everything that I felt, learned, all my preferences and prejudices, and so on and so forth." I mean, everyone was busy. My economist colleagues were busy writing the new economics. Someone else was busy writing about education. Others were writing about other subjects. It was my job to talk about humanitarian work, including disasters, crisis, conflicts, because that's what I'd kind of drifted into from my initial career in health. I'd moved on to what is called emergency health aid in those days, not even humanitarian. And so I kind of wrote furiously for about a week, wrote and rewrote and rewrote and rewrote. It all had to be compressed, of course. And much to my amazement, all verbatim what I had drafted duly appeared in the first white paper of the government in 97. That's the first white paper issued by the British government for I don't know how many decades. And this was also part of the creation of the Department for International Development, which then became an independent aid ministry within the Foreign Office. So in that policy that we drafted, which Claire Short blessed and was champion of, was new humanitarianism. And fundamentally at the heart of it was how do we move from just dealing with the consequences of crisis to actually tackle root causes? How do we also try to take a consistent approach? For example, why should we be selling loads of arms to countries that are also in huge recipients of aid? That be coherence across government. And so that idea of development and that idea that humanitarian aid used in a way that actually dealt with underlying causes as much as it did to comfort people was at the center of it, and was highly controversial.
How effective was that policy in terms of your mission to North Korea, where you led an EU delegation in 1998. Just, I think, as news was breaking about a major famine across the country.
Yes, that's right. So, exactly. I think North Korea was in the news on and off because of the nuclear weapons issue. And then the other news that took over was that there was both famine and floods. And just about the time the UK became president of the European Union, as you know, the periodic presidency. And of course, now the UK has Brexited, sadly. But I suddenly found myself in my capacity as the head of the humanitarian department, if you like, the president of the European kind of combined EU effort. So I wanted to do something that was kind of European in approach. So I sort of dreamt up of a joint mission to North Korea, to DPRK, of the EU. I think there were 15 members at that time. And of course, it was very popular. No one had ever been to North Korea very much. Everyone wanted to come. Even little EU countries who had no aid program of their own suddenly wanted to down our humanitarian mission. And of course, the European Commission, ECHO. That's how we found ourselves in DPRK, trying to. A mission was about how do we allow WFP, the World Food Programme, access to monitor the food aid it was providing, because the North Koreans would not allow WFP access beyond the the central delivery points. At the same time, the Americans were playing naughty games. They were tying food with how compliant North Korea or how corporate North Korea was in terms of its nuclear ambitions. So I confronted another humanitarian dilemma. In Rwanda, I confronted the humanitarian dilemma of treating the genocidaires on an equal basis to the victims, because once they had fled Rwanda, they were no longer perpetrators and they were suffering as much as anyone else. We had to help them, as you remember. And in North Korea, I was faced with another humanitarian dilemma, which was how to resist the political maneuverings of Western donors, which were saying squeeze the North Koreans. And yet when we went there and we saw the deprivation and starvation that was going on, and people literally were eating grass. And I even sampled the grass just to get an idea of what grass tastes like, if you like. And I can tell you it's not got much to claim for it, if you like to see. So we had to take I'm not sure I made myself very popular, but being in the presidency of the European Union at the time for the 6 months really helped. So we drove through a policy, and I think food aid could be provided without it being linked to the nuclear issue.
You also got some interesting insights into the political apparatus and machinations of the government, and suddenly found out that you were a very good golfer, I believe.
Yes, absolutely. I think I am a fantastic golfer, in fact, because the DPRK obviously looked after us extremely well. They had built a wonderful golf course, 18-hole, or God knows, this looked like a 36-hole golf club. I'd never seen golf course. I'd never seen anything like it. And this was built to get all the tourists out of Japan and elsewhere they're hoping for. So we found ourselves on this golf course as part of a trip around the country. And they said, would you like a game of golf? I said, well, I never played golf, but sure, why not? And suddenly I found myself so skilled. I could get all my balls in all holes. And I thought, wow, what a natural talent I was. And for the life of me, I couldn't understand how the North Korean golf officials were swinging it, that I was scoring in all the holes. And it gave me huge respect for the power of the North Korean state at that time.
Oh. There was a tragic side to that trip as well, Mukesh. Your interpreter was executed, you believe, as a result of your own efforts to get up close and personal with the people of Pyongyang.
Yeah, I have to say this is one of those. Well, there are several uncomfortable experiences. One evening we were marooned in the hotel that we owned, and our minders and were our minders had gone home, and so a colleague and I decided to actually just walk out of the front door of the Corio Hotel. That's the main hotel there, and to go and see what was on. And we went out, we had a walk, and we realized what a poor city Pyongyang was. We went to the railway station, and we wandered around for an hour and to get an idea of how things were on the ground. And people literally looked starved and half-clothed and so on. Anyway, we came back, and our chief interpreter and chief minder failed to turn up the following morning, and subsequently we heard that he had been executed for letting us out of his sight, or letting me out of his sight. And I know the North Koreans were. I mean, my hotel suite, and of course, as the leader of the EU delegation, I had a proper suite with a one-way mirror. So and of course, everything was bugged. So when I was reporting back to London and having conversations, it was very clear what we had done and not done. So, it then made me think that whereas we take many things for granted, or at least I took for granted in those days, for others, it's a matter of life and death.
And another very appalling incident that you describe in the book was your experience in Afghanistan under the Taliban, where you went along to witness the execution of a young woman in public. I found that very hard to read, actually.
Yeah, I mean, this was during the heat of the Taliban days, and I was part of my job as the head of the humanitarian sphere in the UK government was to go in and out of Afghanistan. And there was a British embassy there, but it was in mothball. And but I was allowed to go in there. I also lived in the UN guest house on my frequent trips to Afghanistan. One of these trips, I got to hear that there was going to be a public execution in the football ground in Kabul, and I had resolved that by then that I would bear witness. I had already had the experience of Rwanda. I had resolved that I would bear witness to everything I saw, however horrible it was. So I went along to the football field, and there you are. I mean, the young woman had allegedly committed adultery. She was first stoned until blood covered her clothes, and the whole stoning and killing process took a good half hour, good 20 minutes. I mean, it felt as if it was much, much longer. And it was the most horrible and savage thing that I've seen, to the point that, when I think about it now, and the image comes into my head, images come into my head of what I saw in Rwanda, I get this kind of taste in my mouth. I can smell it and taste it. It was so horrible. I couldn't take photos, even though I should have taken photos in order to get the evidence, if you like. But it was utterly awful.
Did you have any qualms of conscience about being there?
Any qualms of conscience? Well,
conscience, yeah.
Of conscience? No. I mean, I felt helpless, in the sense that here I was witnessing what was going on, and was totally powerless to do anything. All we could do was to pick up the pieces afterwards to this, i.e., humanitarian assistance to suffering people, and that was, of course, my job. But the sense of complete disempowerment, and it made me understand how much how when you think you have power, you have very little. I remember, for example, I was desperately trying to save the Bamiyan Buddhas. You remember the statues in Bamiyan, which were destroyed by the Taliban, and sorry to say, but people can die and be replaced. I mean, I don't want to sound callous about it, but this completely irreplaceable, world heritage of the Bamiyan Buddhas, and the Taliban threatened to destroy them. And I was very centrally involved in the diplomacy to try and stop them doing that. And of course, we failed, as you know, and that made me very angry. So I think it was a combination of feeling helpless but at the same time feeling angry, and it made me understand that in the end, it made me also realize that if I was going to do anything, I had to stand up and do whatever I could for whatever was left of my career and life to take a position on those issues.
Mukesh, you described Sudan as the most monumental experience of my life so far. And of course, that's clear to anybody who's read your first book, Against a Tide of Evil. Coming to Sudan after what you'd already experienced in Bosnia, in Rwanda, and other places, were you that surprised at how things unfolded in terms of the international reaction to the genocide in Darfur, which you helped to expose?
Well, I think people ask me this question about Sudan, and I always answer by saying that my journey into Darfur, into Sudan, actually in 2003, actually started with Rwanda in 1994. As we just discussed, witnessing Rwanda completely changed my outlook, and other places along the way that I also saw. For example, when I was working with Sergio Vieira de Mello, and it took me to old genocide sites like Cambodia. When he was High Commissioner for Human Rights. So when I arrived in Sudan as the UN coordinator, UN resident humanitarian coordinator,
You arrived on April Fool's Day.
I arrived on April Fool's Day 2003. And I hadn't even, to be honest, I hadn't even heard of Darfur. There was certainly no briefing about it. In those days, the UN coordinators got no briefing. Basically, I went to New York, signed my contract, and then I was on a plane into Khartoum with about as much knowledge as I knew about Sudan, was based on my own experience as a medical student in Sudan, because when I was a medical student in Oxford, I had been to Sudan. And I spent a few weeks there. So I actually had more personal knowledge than many UN coordinators do. But generally, I had zero briefing or knowledge, either system or going on there. But it soon became clear that terrible things were happening in Darfur. And then when I went to find out what was happening, I realized that what was happening was just like Rwanda, except the means for committing mass slaughter were different, and the technologies were different, but fundamentally what was going on was premeditated mass slaughter of a group of people on account of their identity. In other words, genocide.
And how did you weigh up your decision to go public on it?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I was quite surprised to find myself, the head of the UN in Sudan. I was known for my critical views of the UN system, but I suppose the UN must have been quite desperate in 2003 because their previous UN coordinators hadn't lasted long, or some of them hadn't even presented out by the Sudanese government. And I wasn't black, I'm not an African, and I wasn't Arab. I wasn't white like you, Dennis. So I wasn't an white imperialist pig like you. I was. In other words, In other words, the Sudanese thought that maybe being Asian, I would be, I don't know, somehow more amenable, and so I was brown and not black or white or Arab. So they tried to co-opt me, and they didn't. I mean, and so but I was angry about all the things I'd experienced in Bosnia, and where I had also seen what had happened in Srebrenica. And I'm angry because one of the few reading matters I had was the inquiry report into Srebrenica and Rwanda that Kofi Annan had commissioned, which pointed very clearly to both the UN's failings as well as Kofi Annan's own feelings, which he acknowledged. So now Kofi Annan was my boss in Sudan. Of course, he was Secretary General, and I was his representative. General Dallaire, used cables and faxes to brief New York. My time in 2003, we were in the email age. So I was sending almost daily reports, and I had my smartphone. Those smartphones were coming in. I had my plane. As the head of the UN, I had my own plane. In fact, I used to wryly boast that I was the Air Chief Marshal of Africa's biggest air force, other than South African Airways, because the UN operation in Sudan was so vast. We had so many planes to do with Operation Lifeline Sudan in the south. So I had my own plane. So, I went and flew over Darfur after overcoming Sudanese government resistance to allow me there. And I took photographs of what was going on, telling the pilot to fly low, and using the pilot's sat-nav systems, emailed my photos straight to Kofi Annan's office in New York. And there was total silence from them. And then I was told by Kiran Prendergast, who was the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, that I should shut up, mind my humanitarian business. It wasn't my job. And I was failing because I wasn't getting enough humanitarian aid into Darfur, and that's what I should concentrate on. So, and this really made me so furious. The silence from the 38th floor, everyone who I respected, the only one who supported me was Jan Egeland, who was the head of OCHA, and therefore my humanitarian boss. Mark Mallet-Brown was my resident coordinator boss. He was the administrator of UNDP. He wasn't very supportive. Secretary General Kofi Annan wasn't very supportive. Prendergast's political affairs wasn't supported. But Jan Egeland really backed me, and he really lobbied that we should brief the Security Council on this matter. And the Secretary General at that time, Kofi Annan, refused because he didn't want to do that. And finally, there was no option but to go public at a time where when New York could not stop me. So I did it when New York was asleep, and I was up. I mean, New York is what, 6-7 hours, ahead of, behind East Africa. So that's basically, it was an act of desperation, having tried 3 months of memos, photographs, documentation, eyewitness accounts, and all that sent to UN headquarters in New York, to which the only reply was total silence. And I'd already learned in Rwanda that when people are silent, then silence costs lives. And this is what happened. And the thing about Darfur is the first genocide of history that we actually we were aware and documented meticulously as it went along. The Nazis, of course, were recording everything, but we only discovered the details of the Holocaust after the Nazis went, and we uncovered their archives. And even it took many years to uncover the worst of what had happened, even though it was suspected, right? And in the case of Rwanda, General Dallaire was sending fax after fax after fax after fax. But in those days, faxes sat on in trays, and when the fax person trundle around from room to room delivering faxes. God knows what happened to them. But in our case in Darfur, the first genocide of the millennium, the first genocide of the modern instant communication age, we could miraculously document, even as you flew over the burning villages in Darfur, what was going on. Never before have we known so much and communicated so fast about what is going on. And it's a story of abysmal failure, if you like. The worst of what we may say, the failure of the UN at that time, in 2003, 2004.
Yeah, personally, I spent a year living in Darfur in 1987, and I was staggered at how quickly the situation deteriorated after that, in such a relatively short period of time. Because when I was there was the usual banditry, etc., but there was no real sign of what was to come, as you saw later. So it's clear that passions were inflamed by the government and provoked by the government to reach such a pitch of hatred against the native people of Darfur.
Yes, well, I think I've learned from my Rwandan experience, and going to other places and my Srebrenica experience, and going for Sergio and his High Commission for Human Rights to Cambodia in the aftermath of the Cambodian genocide, and of course Darfur, that fundamentally genocides are state acts because of authorities in control where you don't have a state. These are orchestrated acts, and it's important to distinguish between lawlessness and violence and genocide. There's violent situations and terrible atrocities done every day in the world, but all situations of atrocity don't end up as genocide. That's why it's extremely important not to think about genocide as just the extreme end of a kind of a cycle of violence. You can't prevent violence just by calling for peaceful societies and building culture of peace. Important as that is, and essential as that is, and hate speech and so on has to be countered. There's no question about that. But genocide is a very special evil, in a way, and it's very, very important for people not to diminish genocide by just looking about it just as an extreme example of what people do to each other. It's a very, very special circumstances that bring that about.
I have a sense from the book, Mukesh, that it left a deep wound on your own psyche to some degree. You describe yourself as an insulin-dependent diabetic contemplating suicide sometime after that experience.
Yes, I mean, in this book, well, after Sudan, I found myself in Geneva, and the way that happened was that when I spoke up, my time was at an end. One, I had death threats against me, and of course, I was still the UN coordinator, and so I had to leave really for my own safety. I was withdrawn, if you like. And anyway, the Sudanese government was going to expel me anyway. And then, but then the question was what to do with Mukesh. And the leadership, UN leadership at the time, decided that Mukesh inside the system was better than Mukesh outside the system, because at least inside the system I'd be bound by some code of conduct. Mind you, I'd already flaunted that by going public on it. Though, I looked at all the rules and regulations. There was nothing in rules and regulations that stops a head of an in-country UN mission to speak to the media. There was nothing in the code of conduct that I needed to consult with anybody before I decided to speak up. Anyway, leaving that aside, they didn't want me to leave the UN system. So a deal was done between Kofi Annan, the UN, and the British government, because I was on secondment from the British government. I was still an official there, but not really an official. I was on secondment. And the World Health Organization, because they suddenly discovered or remembered, as I did myself, that actually I was a doctor, I was a physician. So I found myself in Geneva, straight out of Sudan, in the emergency department of the World Health Organization, and there I languished. And I realize now that I must have been. I mean, I knew about post-traumatic stress syndrome. This is described in the books. I've also studied the textbooks. Well, I also, studied for my exams as a physician. And but my early time in Geneva, it was like I was living in cotton wool. I was just. I wasn't. I was numb. Which I realize now is one of the symptoms of PTSD, to the point that I was suddenly very depressed, and to the point that I started stockpiling insulin because, of course, I knew how to commit suicide. All I had to do was inject enough enough insulin. It's important to make sure you didn't wake up as half cabbage. So I stockpiled insulin with the intention to maybe, kill myself. And I couldn't bear it, because for me, the Darfur chapter was not closed in a way. And WHO was, at that time, it was so kind of, on one hand, they were kind to take me, but they only took me because, the UN pushed and the British government pushed, if you like, you see. But quite honestly, I was told not to talk about these things, to sit quietly, don't say anything, just get on with your job in the emergency department at the time, health action and crisis department.
Do you think enough attention is paid to the mental health of aid workers in difficult situations?
Well, I now realize, to be honest, in those days, we never took much attention of these matters. In fact, you were supposed to be robust and kind of face up to everything. It was a sign of weakness and so on. But now we realize that the stress that aid workers suffer is important, not just in terms of for the individuals concerned, obviously it is, but also then for the quality of the decisions that traumatized aid workers undertake. I think when you have something like post-traumatic stress or other mental health problem, you are not in a fit state to make life and death decisions for others. It's a question, really. And when I realized that it wasn't a question of you yourself being seen as macho or strong, it is a question of whether or not you were doing the right thing for the people you're supposed to be helping, that I really realized that this was actually a very important issue in terms of aid effectiveness, let alone the personal humanitarian side of things.
Mukesh, we could not let you go without asking you to give us some insight into your experiences working for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, where I think your experiences in Sudan also played a part in your arrival there and also your exit.
Yeah, well, what happened was that the Director General of the WHO at that time very inconveniently died.
Most inconvenient for himself.
Most inconvenient for himself, and most inconvenient for me. Rest in peace. He was a good man. So my patron in WHO was gone, and I was wondering what to do. So I started sort of packing my bags, and then I got a phone call from the IFRC a few hundred meters from WHO. And this phone call said whether I would like to come and talk with them. So I said, sure, I'll come and talk with you. And I went there, and I hadn't realized, and there was this room full of people, and I had a very nice chat. And I thought, oh, well, pleasant people. And then they offered me a job. And I was quite shocked. One, I hadn't really applied for any jobs. And secondly, I said to Marco Niscala, who was the Secretary General at that time, I said to him, are you sure you just have to Google me, and you just have to spend 5 minutes asking anyone around that I am quite a notorious person. That I've been in the UN and in WHO, but under sufferance. And are you sure you want to take me on in the Red Cross, Red Crescent, IFRC? And Marcus said, and other colleagues, the head of health at that time, for example, said, no, we know all about you. We've done all the good work, and we want you to come and be with us. So that's how I ended up in IFRC, initially as in the grand position of Special Representative, the Secretary General for HIV and AIDS, and then kind of moved on to other positions, finally ending up as Under Secretary General, from where I left in I think 2012 or something like that, in a way. So, but I tell you, those years from around 2006-ish to about 12-ish have been the most fulfilling time of my life. In the Red Cross, Red Crescent family, I finally felt I had a home. So, the thing I found was that, believe me, I had all my frustrations there as well. The IFRC, like any other organization, has its bureaucracy. But I found a completely different ethos. These were humanitarian people. And then when as part of my job, I traveled around the world, and I've been to God knows how many countries, certainly well in excess of 100, 120, so I last counted, and visited the Red Cross societies, the national societies of at least 70, 80 of those countries. I realized what an extraordinary body of unruly people it is. I mean, think what the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is, apart from the international organizations, the ICRC and the IFRC in Geneva, but then the 190 or national societies in every country, is that it's an inside-outside organization. So, and that was a completely different way of looking at humanitarian work. So I had my problems, but I really enjoyed my time.
What incited you to jump ship in the end?
Sorry?
What incited you to jump ship from this wonderful organization that you describe?
Now you're asking me a difficult question. To be honest, I didn't want to jump ship. But what happened was that the IFRC, the Red Cross Red Crescent, is a neutral, impartial organization. And its work relies on its acceptability and that of its people across political divides and anywhere in the world. It cannot take sides. But for me, at the back of my head, there was unfinished business. While I was my time in the Red Cross world, my heart was still in what I had left behind, and a huge sense of failure that I had presided over the first genocide of the 21st century and been unable to stop it. Despite all the never again, not on my watch, and all the rhetoric we had after Rwanda. And I really wanted to be able to tell my story. And the matters came to a head when the International Criminal Court and others wanted me to kind of bear witness, and the media wanted, and all sorts of things. And I found that I could not speak up because my position at that time as an Under Secretary General, which is one of the senior-most positions in the Red Cross world, I was not allowed to speak. So there was and I wrote this book, Against Tide of Evil, and it was going to be published. And there was only one way to actually maintain my respect for the Red Cross, and that is to actually leave the one organization that I felt really at home in. And that's what took me, because I was being summoned by history, and to be outspoken, because someone said to me, there are many people who can do what other humanitarians can do, or what other doctors can do, or what other public health people can do. There are also many advocates. There are always, there's always Human Rights Watch, there is Amnesty. There are plenty of human rights advocates around in the world. but only you have been in that position of having been in Rwanda, having been in Sudan, having been in Srebrenica, etc., and experiencing these things happening even as you were there. And I learned an important lesson there, and that it is not what you matters; it is the platform which you speak that is important. As I used to say, if you had trained a monkey to sit behind behind the label saying UN and said what had happened in Darfur or Rwanda, it would hit the news. After, of course, the first headline, which is "Monkey Speaks." But the second headline would have been, the head of the UN says this. And the same I found, even with the Red Cross, is that when you spoke with the authority of the organization, it mattered, if you like to see. But I was too much in love with the Red Cross, and still too much in love with the Red Cross. My heart is completely Red Cross, and will always be till I die. That I didn't want to do anything that would, in any sense, reflect badly on the Red Cross, Red Crescent system. And therefore, there was only one way to do, for which I could be true to myself, and that is to leave this body and then pursue my own path.
Mukesh, before we close things, we've a message, an amazing interview of an incredible man, so open and honest. Thank you. Dying to read his books. That's a message from someone in Cork in Ireland. And one question we've had from a listener is, what advice would you give to a young university graduate today if they were contemplating a career in aid and development, humanitarian aid and development?
I would say go for it. I would say that the aid world that I see today has got many problems in it, but I can tell you it's much better than the aid world that I grew up in. So while we criticize the many bad things that are happening in organizations around the world today, the fact is that there is much more of a self-realization about what is going on. Today, I think people are much more less willing to take it, and they're more open with what to say. Even my successors, the UN coordinators, have been much more outspoken than I could be. And when Ban Ki-moon, who was UNSG, and one of the first things he did was, I was invited to see him, and he basically apologized to me. He said that the way the UN at the top and the previous incumbents had treated me, he wanted to apologize. That he said, if I was still in the UN, then today I would be better supported. And when I heard Ban Ki-moon stand up in Kigali on the 20th anniversary of the Rwanda genocide and apologize, and the way, and Ban Ki-moon is very kind of not the most articulate of speakers, and he's also very calm, but I could see the anger in his voice as he said, I am totally, what we let you down. So all those things are happening now. And also the humanitarian world, though there are many bad things happening, and I think, for example, the things I would like to see change in the humanitarian system is it needs to be much more localized. I think too many of our humanitarian organizations have become too big for their boots. We used to speak about banks being too big to fail. I think some of what today's humanitarian organizations, which are multi-billion-dollar operations, are too big to succeed. They need to be somehow broken up also, in the same way that we're now thinking of breaking up Facebook, I understand. So my point here is this, is to the young people of today, or to anyone wishing to contemplate a career in humanitarianism or development, never before has there been so much potential to do good things, change things for the better, rebel against a system in which you will be working, and to stand up, if you like, you see. So I'm very optimistic about it. But of course, there are many, many things to be done. There's too much dependency, there's too much corruption, but I am actually, above all else, so impressed by the progress that has been made compared to where things were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I started down this particular road. So go for it, is my answer.
Mukesh, thank you. My answer would be to advise anyone contemplating such a career would be to read your terrific book on the subject. I don't know if we can see it there in the camera. No Stranger to Kindness. It's a wonderful story of a life lived to the full and very well told, and it touches on much more than we've had time for in the last hour or so. But I would encourage anyone thinking of a Christmas present for a loved one, considering a career in humanitarian aid development work, that this would be a wonderful gift for them, and you can order it on Amazon and other good sources like that. Mukesh, thank you for your time. You've been very generous, and wish you and everyone listening in a very happy Christmas and happy end of year holiday. Thank you, Mukesh.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I've got plastic. I'll wait this one.
Bye-bye, Mukesh. Thank you.
Bye-bye.